There's a kind of marriage that nobody writes songs about. Not the kind where two people fall into each other like they were always meant to. Not the kind with flowers pinned to lapels and a church full of tearful aunts and a groom who can barely breathe from the joy of it. I'm talking about the other kind. The kind where a man stands at the edge of a grave in the December cold, hat in his hands, watching a woman bury someone he called brother, and knows, before the last shovelful of dirt settles, that he's going to offer her his name. Not because he wants to, not because he loves her, but because there's no one else left to do it, and some things in this world still fall to the man standing closest. I was that man. And if you'd told me, on the morning I said those dry, dutiful words in front of a judge in Tucson, that I'd one day look at Clara Aldridge, Clara Holt, by then, and feel something crack open in my chest like a seam giving way under pressure, I'd have told you to lay off the whiskey. But that's the thing about duty. It gets you close enough to a person that you start to see them, really see them, and sometimes what you see changes everything you thought you knew about yourself. This is not a love story I planned to tell. It's the one that happened anyway. The day I married Clara, the wind came off the San Pedro Valley like it had somewhere else to be. It cut through the courthouse square in Tucson with the kind of indifferent force that doesn't care what's happening in its path. A wedding, a funeral, a man trying to light a cigarette and failing 3 times in a row. I was that man. I'd been trying to light that cigarette since we stepped out of Harker's Dry Goods on Congress Street 20 minutes prior, where Clara had bought a pair of plain white gloves because she'd said she wasn't going to stand in front of a judge looking like she'd just come in from the barn, even if, technically, she had. My name is Gideon Holt. I keep a log. I've kept one since I was 14 years old, and my father, a rancher of modest ambitions and iron stubbornness, told me that a man who doesn't write things down is a man who's already started forgetting who he is. I've got 17 of those journals, stacked in a crate under my bunk, and they cover everything from cattle prices to blizzard damages to the night. A Chiricahua raiding party came through the south pasture and left 3 horses gone and 1 fence post split clean in half, by what I could only assume was pure theatrical flair. I write things down because I was taught to. And because, later, I found that the act of putting a thing into words is sometimes the only way I can figure out what I actually think about it. I didn't write anything in my log that night after the wedding. I tried, opened the journal, set it flat on the table in the small room I'd taken at Malone's boarding house while Clara took the bedroom down the hall, uncapped my pen, sat there for a good 20 minutes listening to the wind work at the window and the distant sound of a piano from somewhere on Mayer Street, something with too many sad notes for that hour of the evening. Then I closed the journal and blew out the lamp. 3 weeks before, I'd been out at the Aldridge homestead, helping Thomas replace a section of fencing along the North Creek when the letter arrived. Thomas Aldridge was my oldest friend. We'd come up together on neighboring spreads west of Benson, ridden together in some fights I'd rather not document, and built something like a language between us that didn't require many actual words. He'd married Clara 2 years prior, Clara Reyes she'd been then, daughter of a rancher from down near Nogales, widow of a man who'd died of fever before she was 23. She'd come to Thomas already carrying a kind of quiet that wasn't sadness exactly, more like someone who had learned to walk carefully over ground that had given way beneath them before. I didn't know her well. I knew Thomas loved her in the serious, attentive way he approached everything he cared about, methodically, without theatrics. I knew she worked the ranch with him, kept good books, had a dry sense of humor that surfaced occasionally in the company of people she trusted. I knew she'd lost a child the previous winter, a loss Thomas mentioned only once, standing at the fence line looking at nothing in particular, and I knew enough not to ask about it after that. The letter was from the Army. Thomas had a brother, Jacob, who'd signed on with a cavalry unit out of Fort Lowell. The letter informed Thomas that Jacob had been killed in a skirmish near the border, and that certain matters of property and personal effects required attention. Thomas saddled up that afternoon to ride to Tucson to deal with it. He didn't come back. His horse came back 3 days later, alone with a broken girth strap and a dark stain on the near-side saddlebag that I didn't look at for very long. They found Thomas in an arroyo 6 miles south of the Rincon foothills. They never found who was responsible with any certainty. The sheriff had theories. Out that country, theories were usually all you got. I rode out to tell Clara myself. I don't know why I thought that was something I should do personally rather than sending for the sheriff or the minister. Maybe because Thomas was my friend, and it seemed wrong to let a stranger carry that weight to his door. Maybe because I'd been the one who'd watched him ride away 3 days prior and hadn't thought to offer to go with him. And some part of me was already carrying the arithmetic of that moment in the way you carry small, irresolvable guilts. She was in the yard when I came up the road, hanging laundry of all things, sheets pinned to a rope strung between the porch post and a cottonwood. She had a clothespin between her teeth and one hand raised against the sun to look at me, and before I'd even dismounted I could see in the way she went still that she already knew. Not the particulars, just the shape of the thing. Women who have lost people before develop a kind of early warning system. They read the approach before they hear the words. I took off my hat. I said what I'd come to say. I watched her face do something controlled and devastating. A single hard blink, a press of her lips together, and then a breath so steady it took more strength than most people show in a week. And then she turned and walked inside, and I stood in the yard holding my hat for a long time, listening to the wind in the cottonwood leaves. The problem with the Aldridge homestead was that Thomas had taken out a loan against it to fund the fence replacement and some equipment that hadn't yet arrived. The bank in Tucson was not sentimental about such things. Clara had no male relative within 3 days' ride. She had a ranch hand named Peralta who was loyal and competent. But even Peralta couldn't authorize a transaction or renegotiate a debt in the legal context of 1887 Arizona territory, where the relevant paperwork required a husband's name or a man's signature, or some other arrangement that the territory's legal architecture had decided was the only kind worth recognizing. I spoke to the bank myself, as Thomas's associate and neighbor. The manager, a man named Driscoll with a beard and an air of institutional compassion that was mostly decorative, explained the situation with the particular gentleness people use when they're about to say something that cannot actually be made gentle. The debt was due in 60 days. Without a husband or male trustee, Clara's options for renegotiation were limited to almost none. I rode back to the Aldridge homestead that evening. Clara was sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, looking at the mountains the way people look at things that won't explain anything, but are at least reliable about staying where they are. I sat down on the step below her. I said, "Clara, I want to propose something that's going to sound strange, and I'd appreciate it if you let me finish before you answer." She said, "Gideon, if this is about the bank, say it plain." So I said it plain. She was quiet for long enough that I started to think she was going to tell me to ride home. Then she said, "You'd be giving up a lot for a stranger." I said, "You're not a stranger. You're Thomas's wife." She said, "Thomas is dead." I said, "I know." Another silence. The mountains turned a particular shade of dark blue at their bases. She said, "I'll think on it." She thought on it for 4 days. Then she sent Peralta with a note that said, "The judge in Tucson has Tuesdays open. If you're still willing, I am." I was willing. I was also, if I'm honest, absolutely terrified in a way I hadn't been since the last time someone shot at me from an elevated position. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Judge Calloway was a compact, efficient man who treated every proceeding with the same businesslike respect, regardless of the circumstances, which I appreciated more than I could have said. Clara wore the white gloves she'd bought at Harker's and a dark blue dress that she'd clearly pressed that morning, and she stood very straight and said her words clearly and without any detectable waver, and I did the same, and when it was done, we shook the judge's hand and walked back out into the wind. We didn't eat together that night. We didn't speak about what we'd done. We went to our separate rooms at Malone's like two strangers who happened to be traveling in the same direction, which was, I suppose, exactly what we were. The arrangement was practical from the start, and we both treated it as such. I moved into the spare room at the Aldridge homestead 3 weeks after the wedding. We renegotiated the bank debt under my name and Thomas's existing account, and Driscoll was satisfied, and the ranch was Clara's to run as she saw fit with me as a legal signature when required. I managed my own spread, which was smaller with help from my hand Nico, and split my time between both places. We had breakfast together most mornings because we were already both up and the kitchen was there, and it seemed more wasteful than hostile to cook separately. We talked about livestock prices and whether the creek was running low enough to worry about. We did not talk about Thomas. We did not talk about what we were to each other. I wrote in my log, the arrangement is functioning as intended. Clara runs a tight operation, better books than I keep. Peralta is first-rate. The whole thing has the feel of a business partnership conducted by two people who are each quietly waiting to see if the other will do something unexpected. Then I wrote, I'm the one who keeps doing that, looking at her when she's not looking, trying to figure out what she actually thinks about any of this. I crossed out that last part, then I wrote it back in. If I can't be honest in my own log, I've already started losing the thread of who I am. The Apache came into the situation in early February. Not violently, that's worth saying first, because the word Apache in Arizona territory in that era carried a weight of assumption that I've spent a fair amount of log space trying to examine honestly. What happened was this. Peralta's cousin, a man named Nate who was Chiricahua and had spent the previous year trying to quietly homestead a small parcel of land east of the ranch, showed up at Clara's fence line one January morning with a sick boy and a look on his face that said he'd run out of other options. The boy was his son, fever going on 4 days. Clara came out to the yard and looked at the child and looked at Nate and said, without any particular drama, "Bring him inside." I was there that morning. I watched it happen. I watched Nate, a man who had every reason to distrust every structure of the world he was navigating, carry his son through a door that opened for them because a woman who'd lost enough to understand the weight of a father's face decided that was the reasonable thing to do. I wrote in my log that evening, Clara Holt may be the most quietly formidable human being I have ever shared a kitchen with. I didn't cross it out. The boy's name was Chato. He was 7 years old and had the particular exhausted dignity of a sick child who is trying very hard not to show how scared he is. Clara put him in the spare room, my room, which I'd vacated to the barn cot for the duration without being asked, and set about bringing the fever down with the methodical patience of someone who had done this before and knew that the only real tool available was time and consistency, and cool water and willingness to stay. Nate sat in the kitchen and didn't sleep. I sat with him for part of the night, not because there was anything useful I could do, but because leaving a man alone with that kind of vigil seemed like the wrong kind of economy. We didn't talk much. He spoke English well enough, and I had some Chiricahua badly pronounced that he tolerated without comment. At some point around 2 in the morning, he told me, in the flat, careful way of a person relaying facts rather than seeking sympathy, that his wife had died the previous spring. That Chato was all he had. That he'd come to Clara's fence because he'd seen her deal with Peralta's family honestly, and he'd run out of choices. I said, "You made the right call." He looked at me for a moment like he was deciding how much weight to give that statement coming from me. Then he nodded once and looked back at the door to the spare room. By the 3rd morning, Chato's fever broke. Clara came out of the spare room with her hair coming loose from its braid, and her sleeves rolled up, and that particular expression of a person who has won something by sheer refusal to stop trying, and she looked at Nate and said, "He's asking for water, and I think he said something that might be asking for food, but I don't have your language, so I may have misread it." Nate made a sound that wasn't a word in any language, but that everyone in that kitchen understood completely. He stayed 2 more days, until Chato was sitting up and eating and demanding things in a tone that suggested he was recovering his personality along with his health. Then he took his son and rode east. At the fence line, he turned back and said something to Clara in Chiricahua that I half caught. Something about water and returning, and a word that implied debt in the sense of choice rather than transaction. Clara raised a hand in acknowledgement. She stood at the fence for a moment after they were gone, looking at the space they'd occupied. I came to stand beside her. She said quietly and without looking at me, "Thomas would have done the same." I said, "I know." She was quiet. Then, "That's the first time I've said his name out loud in 2 months." I didn't say anything to that. Some things don't need a response. They just need to be heard by someone standing close enough to hear them. We walked back to the house. The morning was cold and clear, and the mountains were doing that thing they do in February when the light hits them at low angles and makes everything look like it was painted by someone who loved the subject. I held the kitchen door open. Clara walked through without comment. I followed her in and put the coffee on, because it was my turn and I knew where everything was by then, and the morning continued the way mornings do when the emergency is over and ordinary life comes back to fill the space. I didn't write much in my log that night. What I wrote was, something is shifting, I can't name it yet, but I'm paying attention. Spring came to the San Pedro Valley in the way it always does, not all at once, but incrementally, like a man changing his mind about something he'd decided against. First, the cold lost its edge in the afternoons. Then the creek came up 3 inches from snowmelt in the mountains, and the grass along the banks turned a color that seemed almost aggressive after the gray of February. Then one morning I walked out to the barn at 5:30 and realized I hadn't thought about the cold at all, which is how you know a season has actually changed. Not when you notice the warmth, but when you stop noticing the absence of cold. My spread was running well enough. Nico had kept things in order through the worst of the winter, and the cattle were healthy. But I was spending 4 or 5 days a week at the Aldridge place by then, and I told myself it was practical. The combined operation made more sense. The bank situation still required management. Peralta's crew was better suited to the larger acreage when there was an extra hand available. And all of that was true. All of it was also not entirely the point. I wrote in my log, I am present at the Aldridge homestead more than can be strictly explained by logistical necessity. I am choosing not to examine this too closely on the grounds that I have other things to do. This is, I recognize, not my most honest position. Then I sat and looked at what I'd written for a while. Then I went to bed without crossing it out, which was the most honest thing I'd done in 3 weeks. Clara had started leaving coffee on for me. This was a small thing. In the arithmetic of daily life on a working ranch, it was nearly invisible, a pot sitting on the back of the stove, still warm when I came in from the early morning check of the south pasture fence that I'd taken to running because it was a legitimate reason to be there at 6 a.m. She didn't mention it, and I didn't mention it. But I noticed that she'd figured out how I took it. No sugar, enough milk to take the edge off, and had left it that way without asking. The small kindnesses are the dangerous ones. Grand gestures you can absorb and categorize and file under appreciation and move on. It's the small ones that accumulate in the body without asking permission. In March, I got a letter from my cousin Emil in Colorado, asking if I had any interest in a business proposition involving cattle and transport that would require my presence in Denver for 2 to 3 months beginning in April. Emil had money and connections, and a way of making things sound more certain than they were. And the proposition was probably halfway to a real opportunity and halfway to wishful thinking, the way most of Emil's ideas were. I put the letter in my coat pocket and didn't answer it for 2 weeks. I knew why. I didn't want to say that out loud, even in my log, so I didn't say it. I just carried the letter around until it went soft at the folds from being handled. One evening, Clara found me on the porch looking at the letter with the particular expression of a man who's been having an argument with himself for a fortnight. And she said, "Is that something I should know about?" I handed it to her, she read it, she handed it back. She said, "You should go." I said, "The bank situation." She said, "Peralta can manage, and Driscoll knows the account now." I said, "That's not what I meant." She looked at me. Clara had a way of looking at a person that wasn't aggressive and wasn't soft. It was just fully present in a way that made evasion feel more exhausting than it was worth. She said, "What did you mean?" I said, "I don't particularly want to go." The silence that followed, that was different from the silences we usually occupied. This one had an edge on it. Not unpleasant, more like the silence before weather when the air is doing something preparatory and you don't yet know what it's going to become. Clara said, "That's an interesting thing to say." I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm going to think about what you mean by it." I said, "All right." She went inside. I sat on the porch for another hour, listening to the coyotes starting up in the East Hills, and I did not go for the log and I did not go in. I just sat there with the letter in my hand and the particular feeling of a man who has said more than he meant to and less than he meant to simultaneously. I wrote Emil back the following morning and told him the timing wasn't right. Nate came back in April. He came alone this time, and he came to the front gate in the late afternoon with a small bundle and that same careful face, the one that carried its own history quietly, the way a river carries the memory of all the terrain it's crossed in the particular color of its water. Clara went out to meet him. I was fixing a hinge on the barn door, and I watched from across the yard, close enough to observe but far enough to leave the exchange the privacy it deserved. He gave her the bundle. She took it. They spoke for a few minutes. She nodded. He nodded. He looked across the yard once in my direction, not quite making eye contact, and I raised a hand, and he raised his and then mounted and rode back east. Clara came back to the yard, and I let the barn door go and walked over. She opened the bundle. It was a piece of worked leather, a bridal piece intricately decorated, the kind of thing that takes patience of a particular and disciplined kind. She turned it over in her hands. He said it's a returning gift, that there's no word for it in English that exactly fits, but that it's what you give to someone who gave you something that couldn't be paid back. She paused. He said to give half of it to the man of the house. She looked up at me then. I said you should keep it. She said he was specific. I said Clara. She said Gideon, just my name, but in a voice I hadn't heard her use before, lower and more direct, as if she'd decided something while I was talking. She held out the leather piece, and when I took my half of it, our hands were close enough that I could see the particular calluses on her right hand from the fence work she'd done that week, and the small scar at her wrist from a wire incident, the previous summer that she described to me with total factual calm, while I tried not to show how much it bothered me to have not been there. I held that half of the returning gift and looked at it, and when I looked up, Clara was still looking at me. She said, "You've been kind to me." I said, "You've been kind to me first." She made a small sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but the shape of one, and the first one I'd heard from her that was anything other than brief and controlled. It lasted only a second, and then she pressed her lips together and looked at the mountains like she was surprised it had happened. I wanted to say a dozen things then. I said none of them. Instead, I said, "I'll put the coffee on," because it was nearly 5 and we'd been at the fence work since noon, and that was the appropriate and useful thing to say. She said, "Yes, do that." We walked to the house. The evening light was doing what it does in April in that country, long and gold and utterly indifferent to what it's illuminating, which in this case was a man and a woman walking side by side across a yard, not quite touching, carrying objects given to them by a father whose gratitude had no exact English equivalent, and not saying any of the things they were clearly both thinking. The night of the lightning storm, I made a mistake. In my defense, it was the kind of mistake that looks much clearer in retrospect than it does in the moment when the roof is leaking in 2 places, and the cattle are restless in the south pasture, and there's a rolling thunder that sounds like the sky is trying to settle a long-standing argument with itself. I'd been over at my own spread for 3 days, a genuine logistical reason, for once, related to Nico's family situation that required me present. And I came back to the Aldridge homestead in the middle of a storm that had started as weather and escalated into something with ambitions. The bridge on the creek road was questionable, and I'd pushed through it because the alternative was waiting until morning in a camp with no roof, and a horse who was already expressing opinions about the lightning. I came in the back door, which was the practical door, the one we both used, the one that had stopped having any formality attached to it sometime in February, and I was soaked through and shaking from the cold and carrying the saddlebags with both hands because one of them had the strap gone and the other had correspondence I needed to keep dry. Clara came out of the kitchen holding a lamp. She looked at me for one moment with an expression I couldn't entirely read, something between alarm and relief and something else I didn't have a word for, and then she set the lamp on the table and said, "Get those clothes off before you catch your death in my kitchen." This was practical and reasonable, and the obvious thing to say. I leaned the saddlebags against the wall and started with the coat, and Clara was already at the stove getting the banked fire going, and the kitchen was filling with the sound of rain against the roof and the stove beginning to come alive, and I had the coat half off when I lost my grip on the wet sleeve and turned at the wrong moment and we collided. Her coming back from the stove, me turning from the coat hook, and her hand caught my arm to keep herself from going into the table. And for a second we were just standing there, very close, my coat still tangled at my elbow and her hand on my arm, and the lamplight doing what lamplight does in enclosed spaces during storms, which is make everything feel more immediate than it might otherwise be. She didn't step back. I didn't step back. She said very quietly, "Gideon." I said, "Yes." Then I said, "I'm sorry I turned it the wrong." She said, "Stop apologizing." I stopped. She looked at me for a moment that I could not have timed if I tried. Then she stepped back not quickly and turned to the stove and said, "I'll heat water. You'll want to be warm." I finished taking off the coat. I sat down at the kitchen table. I was warm, actually, from something that had nothing to do with the stove. I did not write in my log that night. For 3 days after the storm, we were careful with each other in a way that was different from our earlier carefulness. The first carefulness had been practical, two people establishing the terms of a functional arrangement, respectful distance, appropriate roles. This carefulness was something else. This was the kind that comes from too much awareness, from knowing that a moment happened and neither of you have decided what to do with it yet. We talked about cattle. We talked about the creek road, which had flooded and needed clearing. We talked about a letter from Driscoll about an adjusted payment schedule that was actually quite favorable. We did not talk about anything that mattered. I was starting to feel the accumulated weight of 6 months of not talking about things that mattered. The Apache elder came on a Thursday. I didn't know who he was at first. He came up the road in the early morning on a gray horse, moving slowly, with the unhurried dignity of a person who has decided that arriving is not a race. He was older, late 60s maybe, with white at his temples, and a face that had the particular quality of stone that's been weathered by an honest amount of weather. He had a young man with him who I later came to understand was a nephew serving as translator, though the elder's own English, when he chose to use it, was careful and sufficient. He came to the fence. I was there. He looked at me and said, "The woman who took in the boy." I said, "That's this place." He said, "I want to speak to her." I went and got Clara. She came to the fence and they spoke, mostly in Chiricahua, with the nephew providing some of the bridge work, for the better part of an hour. I sat on the fence post nearby, which was my version of respectful availability, and I watched, and I did not pretend I wasn't watching. What I could see was this: the elder spoke and Clara listened with her full attention, which was not a small gift. The elder said something that made Clara press her hand flat against the fence post as if she needed something solid. The elder said something else that made her nod slowly twice. At the end, the elder reached into a bag at his side and brought out something wrapped in cloth. He held it out. Clara took it with both hands. The elder looked at me then, a direct, appraising look that lasted about 4 seconds and felt like being read by someone who had been reading people for a very long time. And then he turned his horse and rode back down the road. Clara stood at the fence for a long moment. I climbed down off the post and came and stood beside her. She unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a small object, carved stone, roughly the size of a fist, in the shape of something I couldn't immediately identify. Later, I'd learn it was a rendering of a bear, specifically the kind of bear that Chiricahua tradition associated with healing and returning things to their proper form. She held it in both hands and looked at it. Her eyes were bright. Not crying, Clara did not, as far as I could observe, cry easily or often, but the kind of bright that lives at the edge of it, the kind that you hold back by the particular exercise of, well, she'd been demonstrating since the day I rode up her road and took off my hat. She said, without looking up from the stone, "He said Chato's family considers this place sacred, that what I did is the kind of thing that gets remembered in the stories they tell their children." She paused. "He said the woman who acts like that is carrying something heavy and should be told it's noticed." I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "He's right." She looked up at me then, and the look was unguarded in a way I hadn't seen before. Not the careful widow face, not the competent rancher face, not the careful not to want too much face she'd been wearing since the day I rode up and took off my hat. Just her face. Just Clara. I said, "You've been carrying Thomas and everything before Thomas and everything since, and you've done it without making anyone feel the weight of it. That's not a small thing." She said, "Neither have you." I said I had less to carry. She said, "That's not how I've seen it." The morning sat around us, very still after the elder's departure. The mountains were white at their peaks still from the last of the winter snow. A hawk was doing something meditative over the south pasture. Clara said, "Gideon, I need to ask you something and I need you to answer it honestly." I said, "All right." She said, "When you married me, was there any part of it that wasn't duty?" I looked at the mountains. I thought about my log. I thought about all the things I'd written down and all the things I'd crossed out and then written back in. I said, yes, there was a part that wasn't duty, but it was small then, and I didn't name it because it didn't seem fair to either of us. She said, and now? I said, now it's not small. She nodded slowly. She was still holding the stone bear in both hands. She said, I'm going to need some time to think about what I want to do with that. I said, take all the time you want. She looked at me again. Something in her face shifted, barely the way a current shifts under water you're looking down into from a bank, a change in what's moving underneath. She said, you're a very patient man, Gideon Holt. I said, I keep a log. I've learned how to wait out what I can't immediately figure out. That got the almost laugh again, closer to an actual laugh this time. The shape of it stayed in her face for a moment after the sound was gone. She walked back to the house. I went to the barn. I took out my log and wrote, something is either about to happen or I'm going to spend the rest of my life being very near it. I don't know which. I find I can live with the not knowing in a way I couldn't have 6 months ago. I closed the log. I got back to work. The night the kiss happened, I had not been planning for it. I want to be clear about that, because the way these things get told in retrospect always sounds like inevitability. Like two people who were obviously moving toward each other from the beginning, like the outcome was written into the first scene. That's not what it felt like from inside. From inside, it felt like every other ordinary evening at the Aldridge homestead in mid-May, which is to say, we'd had supper, we'd argued briefly about whether the upper pasture gate needed replacing now or in the fall. I'd conceded the point because she was right, and we'd gone out to the porch afterward the way we did most evenings because the nights in May in that country are worth being present for. Clara was sitting in the chair at the far end of the porch, Thomas's chair originally, which I'd noticed she'd claimed in the months since his death in the way you claim the things left by people you've lost, not with sentimentality, but with a kind of stubborn continuity. I was sitting on the step with the log in my lap, not writing in it, just holding it the way I sometimes did when I was thinking rather than recording. The sky was doing something extraordinary. Clouds had been building all afternoon in the west, and they'd gone purple at their edges with the last of the sunset, and the first stars were appearing in the gaps between them, and the whole thing had the quality of a painting executed by someone who felt no particular obligation to be modest about the available palette. Clara said, "What are you writing?" I said, "Nothing yet, still thinking." She said, "What are you thinking about?" I turned and looked at her. The light was low and warm, the last of it, and she was sitting with her feet pulled up under her the way she did when she decided the day was finished, and she could occupy space in whatever way was comfortable. Her hair was down. She'd unbraided it after supper, and it fell across one shoulder in the way that still, after 6 months, made me lose approximately 30% of whatever thought I'd been having. I said, "I'm thinking about whether to say something I've been not saying for a while." She said, "How long a while?" I said, "Some months." She was quiet. The hawk that lived near the south pasture went over, invisible, identifiable only by the sound. She said, "Then say it." I said, "I love you, Clara." I said it in the flat, straightforward, no decorative furniture way that is the only honest way to say a thing like that. And then I waited, because that's what you do after you've said a true thing. You let the air around it settle, and you don't add anything because adding things is almost always about managing your own discomfort rather than respecting the other person's time with the words. She looked at me for a long time. Her face went through something I couldn't entirely follow, something with memory in it and loss and caution, and something else that was fighting its way through all of those layers toward the surface. She said, "I've been afraid of that." I said, "I know." She said, "Not afraid that you'd say it. Afraid of what I'd feel when you did." I said, "What do you feel?" She looked at the sky. She looked back at me. She said, "Like something that's been wound very tight for a very long time just." She made a small gesture with her hand, an opening motion, fingers spreading. "Let go." I set the log down on the step. I stood up. I crossed the porch to where she was sitting, and I crouched down so we were at eye level, and I put my hand against her face, which was the first time I'd touched her face in 6 months of standing very close to her, and I could feel her breath change under my palm and her eyes stayed on mine, and I leaned forward and I kissed her. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was not the kind that belongs in the stories I'd heard men tell in saloons about the women who undid them. It was soft and careful, and it lasted about 4 seconds. And when it ended, we were both very still, foreheads nearly touching, and I could feel her hand on my wrist, not pulling away, just resting there, present. She said, barely above a whisper, "Oh." I said, "Yes." She laughed. An actual laugh, full and unguarded, the kind I hadn't heard from her before. Not the almost laugh, not the edge of it, but the whole thing, bright and startled. And she put her hand over her mouth immediately like she was surprised at herself. And then lowered it, and her eyes were bright again, the same bright as when the elder had given her the stone bear, but different, because this time she let it be what it was. I sat down on the boards at her feet. She didn't tell me to move. She put her hand on the top of my head, briefly, the way you touch something you're relieved still exists, and then settled back in the chair, and we watched the stars fill in the gaps between the clouds. I wrote in my log the next morning, "Last night changed something. I don't fully understand the shape of what it's changed yet. That will take time and honesty and probably some arguing, which we are both equipped for. But I know this. I came to this woman's fence out of duty to a dead man I loved, and somewhere in the 6 months since, duty became something I don't have a simpler word for. Clara is not a project to be managed or a debt to be repaid. She is the most rigorously honest person I've ever known, and she has chosen to be kind to me in small ways for months without calling it anything. And I have chosen to stay here beyond any practical requirement without calling it anything. And last night we both called it something. I don't know what happens next, neither does she. The ranch still has an outstanding equipment delivery. The upper pasture gate genuinely does need replacing in the fall. She was right about that. Nico needs attention at my own spread. Nate and Chato are somewhere east of here living their lives. All of that will continue to be true. What's also true is that I kissed Clara Holt on her porch last night, and she laughed afterward, and I don't think I'll ever stop being grateful for that laugh. We did not immediately transform into something easy. That's the thing about two people who have each been broken by things before. They don't fall into softness without caution. We moved toward each other the way cautious people move across uncertain terrain, testing each step, watching the ground, not rushing. There were evenings when she went quiet in the way that meant she was back inside a memory I wasn't part of and couldn't reach her in, and I had learned to leave her there, to be present without intruding, which is a particular discipline that I suspect most people don't develop until they've made the mistake of intruding first. There were mornings when I came in from the pre-dawn check with some piece of cattle business that reminded me of Thomas in the specific, useless way that grief arranges reminders, and she would see it in my face and hand me the coffee without comment and let the moment be what it was. We argued about the gate. She won. We argued about whether to sell 3 of the older cattle in May or hold them to June. I won and turned out to be wrong, and she accepted the outcome with a graciousness I tried to learn from. We sat on the porch most evenings when the work was done and watched the sky do whatever it was going to do and talked about the things that needed talking about, and sometimes the things that didn't need talking about but felt good to say anyway. In June, Peralta came to find me in the barn with a look on his face that said something had happened. What had happened was that Nate had sent word through a mutual contact. A Tohono O'odham man named Santos, who moved between communities with a facility and a natural diplomatic credential that neither territory governments nor Apache leadership had yet figured out how to formalize. The word was that Nate's parcel east of the ranch was in dispute, that a land agent from Tucson had arrived with paperwork that Nate didn't have the standing to contest in the current legal framework, and that Chato was sick again. Not fever this time, but the particular sickness of a child watching his father fight, a losing battle against a system that had already decided the outcome. I went in and told Clara. She said, "We need to talk to Driscoll." I said, "Driscoll is a bank manager." She said, "He's also on the county land committee and he owes us a civil interaction after the way he handled our renegotiation." She was already pulling on her jacket. "Get the horses." I got the horses. What followed was 3 weeks of the kind of work that doesn't look heroic from the outside. Correspondence and meetings and careful conversations with men who had the authority to do things and the instinct not to, and the very specific skill of making those men feel that doing the reasonable thing was their own idea. Clara was better at this than I was. She had a way of presenting a situation that made the injustice visible without making the man in front of her feel accused, which is a more difficult skill than it sounds, and one that I watched her deploy with the patience of someone who had long ago decided that getting the right outcome mattered more than being seen to be right about it. Driscoll was, in the end, useful. Not from generosity. I don't want to give him credit he didn't earn in the right spirit, but from the realization that the land agent's paperwork had procedural problems that made it a potential embarrassment to the county if challenged by anyone with standing to challenge it. Clara had standing, by way of being an adjacent landowner with a documented relationship to the family in question. I had standing by way of being Clara's husband, which in the legal arithmetic of 1887 meant my name opened doors that hers alone would not have. I used that name without particular pride and with the clear understanding that the situation was an indictment of the architecture that made it necessary. I wrote that in my log. I thought about it a lot during those 3 weeks. The outcome was not perfect. In the territory, in that era, outcomes rarely were. But Nature's parcel was secured against the specific challenge, and the land agent was persuaded to redirect his paperwork toward more defensible transactions, and Chato's father was able to take his son home to a place that would still be theirs the following morning. Santos brought us a message from Nate afterward that the nephew translated as something like, "Tell the woman she plants things in hard ground and does not walk away to see if they grow." Clara read it twice. Then she folded the paper and put it in her jacket pocket and went out to check on the cattle. I watched her go. That evening later, after supper, I found her in the yard. She was standing at the fence line on the south side, looking east the way she did when she was thinking past the horizon. I went and stood beside her. She said, "I keep thinking about what Thomas would say." I said, "What do you think he'd say?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I think he'd say he was glad it was you." I didn't respond to that immediately. Not because I didn't have a response, but because some things need to land before you answer them. I said, finally, he'd have been right. She leaned into me then, not dramatically, not with the weight of a person who's lost their footing, but with the easy lean of someone choosing to rest against something they've decided is solid. Her shoulder against my arm. Her face tilted slightly toward the east, where the first of the night's stars were beginning. I put my arm around her. Neither of us said anything for a long time. I have kept 17 journals. The first one is from when I was 14, and it mostly concerns cattle weights and the number of fence posts along the eastern boundary, and a girl named Anne who I was convinced at the time would be important to my life in a permanent way, and who I later learned married a lawyer in Santa Fe and is, by all accounts, doing well. The most recent one is the one I've been keeping since the month Thomas died, and it is by a significant margin the most honest log I've ever maintained. I've written things in it that I've crossed out and then written back in. I've written things I didn't fully understand until I wrote them. I've written things that were true when I wrote them and became more true as the weeks went by. On the last page I'd filled before this particular evening, I'd written, "A man can enter into an arrangement out of duty and find that duty is not the ceiling but the floor. Not where you end up but where you start. And sometimes where you start is the most important thing because it gets you close enough to a person to actually see them, and sometimes what you see is worth everything the duty cost you." I thought about that, standing at the fence with Clara leaning against my arm. I thought about Thomas, who had loved her in his serious and attentive way, and whom I still missed with the quiet, steady ache of someone losing a fixed point they'd navigated by. I thought about Chato and Nate, and the stone bear sitting on Clara's windowsill in the kitchen where she'd placed it 3 months ago and never moved it. I thought about the elder on the gray horse, reading me in 4 seconds with the kind of attention that most people never apply to anything. I thought about the kiss on the porch, and Clara's laugh, and the way she'd put her hand on my head afterward like she was checking that I was real. I thought, this is what happens when you do the right thing not because you've calculated the return, but because the alternative is being the kind of man who doesn't. The night came fully in around us. The coyotes started somewhere north. Clara said without moving, "Gideon." I said, "Yes." She said, "I think I'm going to keep the name Holt." I said, "You were always going to keep whatever name you wanted." She said, "I know, I'm telling you what I want." I held that for a moment. I said, I'm glad. She nodded once slowly. Her weight was easy against my arm. East of us, somewhere out past where the ranch roads ended and the territory just became itself, Nate and Chato were in their home. The mountains were doing their nightly thing with the stars. The creek was running at a level that suggested we'd have enough through the dry season if it held. The gate on the upper pasture still needed replacing. Clara would be right about the timing. I didn't think about any of that right now. There's a line in my log, the very last thing I wrote the night of the wedding, 11 months ago now, that I didn't finish. I wrote "married today" and stopped. I've been thinking about what came after that, what I would have written if I'd been honest enough to write it. I think it would have been, I don't know what I'm doing. I know what I'm doing is right. I hope those two things can be the same.